At the same time that the 20s was a time of general economic prosperity and expansion of new forms of entertainment and fun, it was also a time of great conflict. And this took a lot of forms. Conflict isn't always something that's necessarily negative, although it certainly can be, and we'll see plenty of that here. But it can also include healthy forms of conflict or engagements within a community that lead to innovation and new forms of thinking or ways of doing things. And in the 20s, there's plenty of that too. Conflict can also be deeply personal and internal. And in the wake of World War I, there's a whole ton of personal conflict that goes on within people who want to move on from the war that just ravaged the planet while also trying to handle internally the struggle of processing exactly how to do that. So, for the next little bit, let's break down what these various forms of conflict look like. One major form of conflict that occurred during the 1920s was ideological conflict. Just like any other time you're dealing with an ideology, it doesn't just stay something that people think or believe. In the 20s, ideologies turn into social and political action that have very real consequences for a variety of people. One of the overarching conflicts we see in the 20s and beyond really is that of ideology. Here we're specifically dealing with a kind of mix of religion and science, which honestly is not new. So in the 20s, you have two big sides to this debate, being the fundamentalists and the modernists. Fundamentalists believe that the Bible is literally 100% true, every word of it. So in the context of Darwin's theory of evolution, which eats up tons of this debate, they would believe that the first chapter of the book of Genesis that says that God created the earth in 6 days and then spent Sunday afternoon on his front porch sipping iced tea is the literal truth, except for the tea and porch part, although I guess we don't presume to know what God does on his Sunday afternoons. For modernists, there's some room for flexibility, so they're not like saying that the Bible is now a book of trash and that we should throw it out, but they're willing to accept that perhaps the Bible should be taken in addition to understandings of science. So, like, they would accept that perhaps we don't know what time works like in heaven where God lives, and maybe a day to God is like a billion years in Milky Way time. So, loosely, evolution might work out with that math. So, they still believe in literally all of the basic moral principles of the Bible and things like that. They're just willing to look at a science textbook and say, I don't know, maybe. So this leads to all kinds of drama, though, especially in public schools, because really, until you start dragging people's kids into this, nobody really cares what weird things you think about in your own time. So in 1925, the American Civil Liberties Union puts out an ad asking for a teacher to come forward who's willing to be sued for teaching evolution in their classroom. So John Scopes, a football coach and science teacher from Dayton, Tennessee, agrees, although he'd only ever taught biology once as a sub. So they invite the principal and everyone to class because otherwise how else will anyone know what he taught? And he is promptly arrested. And in this trial, he's defended by attorney Clarence Darrow, who's known as a really great speaker and being really in favor of the First Amendment right to things like freedom of religion and expression and such. The prosecutor, former Populist Party leader William Jennings Bryan, takes the position that this is an attack on the Bible itself. He's also like super old at this point. Like literally, he dies a week after the trial. But as much as Bryant was against the theory of evolution, he was really against evolution as he saw it entangled with the idea of eugenics. In closing remarks that he never delivered on account of dying, he wrote that the very idea of evolution paralyzes people because it gives hope to the higher ups in society that they can just solve the problem of the country by controlling what he calls the, quote, scientific breeding of the masses. And that's not to say that he indicates here whether he did or didn't support whether that was something that should or shouldn't be done as a moral issue, but he says that the major issue is that it takes away the very basis of what is American to him, the idea of the Protestant work ethic, of rugged individualism. And eventually, those with the means would create a society where they are always the fittest to survive. Because remember, Brian's background, he used to fight politically against corporations and the greed of society. He knows exactly what technology and science in the wrong hands can do. And it would seem, although we can't really be entirely certain since he never delivered the remarks, that that's the way he was inclined to think about evolution. In addition to hailing Bryan as the spokesperson and representative of the fundamentalist cause during the Scopes trial, or what came to be called the Scopes monkey trial, fundamentalist leaders also started using new technologies like the radio to spread their message of evangelism to wide audiences. Whereas religious leaders in the progressive era tended to focus on community efforts towards reform and humility, radio preachers of the 1920s held airwave revivals, almost like those from the Great Awakenings, that were heavy on emotionalism, but this time also mixed with a heavy dose of patriotism. For American men in particular, the imagery of Jesus as a central figure also emphasized him, as historian Michael Bronski describes, as, quote, a forthright, manly, decisive American who was physically strong, an adventurer, political, and certainly a capitalist, end quote. This new imagery went a long way to drawing American men into a world of religion typically seen as dominated by women for its emphasis on meekness and gentleness. It also drew religion more heavily into the everyday realm of casual political discussion. Another form of ideological conflict is the Red Scare, which occurred primarily as a result of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. And we know that Americans didn't like the ideas of socialism before this, but they didn't necessarily start taking more violent action against perceived radicals until around the same time as Russia's revolution in 1917. For example, the Wobblies labor strike that led to the Bisbee deportation of striking workers into the Arizona desert in the summer of 1917 without food or water happened within this context. But what we often perceive as the Red Scare, or the national assault against Bolshevism and perceived anti-democratic behavior, although exactly what that would mean is a whole variety of things, really started in about the spring of 1919 and lasted until the summer of 1920. In April 1919, the extreme anarchist radicals bombed the home of Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. A series of other bombs were sent to other high-ranking government officials and wealthy persons, but were intercepted by the post office. This event is often perceived as the more or less beginning of the National Red Scare. As a result, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover led a series of raids, now called the Palmer Raids, against the businesses and homes of suspected radicals. But by suspected, what's really meant is that these usually were just immigrants or people that the FBI or the government found to be less than patriotic in their public speeches. The FBI would ransack their homes or businesses looking for any materials linking them even remotely to communist or socialist causes, and then arrest anyone with even the slightest paper trail of evidence. A book written by a known communist, a poster or flyer laying on a desk that had been handed to them from somebody passing on the street, a letter from someone in Russia discussing the revolution there. At the same time, the American Legion was founded with a purpose to, quote, uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States of America, to maintain law and order, to foster and perpetuate a 100% Americanism, end quote. Apart from the fact that the phrase maintain law and order is typically only used as an excuse to harass communities dominant culture doesn't like, the American Legion's founding purpose here seems to indicate that the United States isn't a place where difference of opinion is welcome. As if a democratic state isn't a place where people are free to express diverging political, religious, social, or political views. But by the fall of 1919, the Legion had well over 500,000 members seeking to uphold these ideals. Now, most of the members were really just handing out papers and pamphlets and encouraging people to vote for certain people, things like that. A lot of their organization was just more of an active form of conservative political activism. But some members actively engaged in violent vigilante justice against people they suspected to be communists, leading to the use of the threatening but extremely common phrase, "Leave the Reds to the Legion." One of the groups hardest hit by Red Scare rhetoric were labor unions. Anti-communist ralliers argued that the very premise of communism meant that labor unions, by their very nature, must be associated with a communist threat, since their entire idea was that it was a battle between workers and the elites. And so during the 20s, you see a whole host of different propaganda aimed at trying to paint labor unions and workers out on strike not only as hurting production, but as literally anarchists bent on destroying democracy. In tons of the images, you have half-human type people, like you see in the image on the right, who are often trying to destroy some symbol of democracy. In this instance, it's the flag. So in this particular cartoon, the laborer is sitting down on a strike, being propped up by the Bolshevik propaganda, and he's going to use the flames of anarchy to burn down, presumably, America. And honestly, there wasn't a lot to do about dealing with the external public image, but labor unions did try to convince laborers themselves to stick with the program. Because after all, during World War I, a lot of labor unions tried to remind workers as much as possible that they had so much more to gain by working through any differences they might have, because they really had more in common than they had different. It was the bosses who were driving them apart by constantly creating division, by creating pay gaps and differences in management. But these were all things in theory that could be fixed by the labor union with enough time. This is what you see in the cartoon on the left. But of course, since the government itself is wrapped up in this anti-communist Red Scare, they're not exactly going to keep on rolling with the pro-union policies like they were before. So during the 20s, governments, especially on the state level, start adopting what are called open shop policies, which means that businesses have to have jobs that are open to all workers, not just those people who are union workers. So in other words, you can't require workers in your factory to join a union as a condition of their employment. It's an open workplace, hence open shop. This is opposed to a closed shop policy where workers are required to join the union as a condition of working there. In theory, open shop policies make it easier for minority workers to get jobs because it means that they can more easily get jobs in places that otherwise would have excluded them because they wouldn't have let them join the labor unions required for employment. But this also means that the conditions of industrial workplaces aren't going to be any particular hurry to accommodate the needs of workers asking for better conditions or better pay, because the unions that do exist aren't in a very strong negotiating position. On top of this, you have systems of what are called welfare capitalism, which is essentially what Henry Ford is doing. So in essence, bosses just take good care of their workers. So the idea here is that if you actually don't treat your workers like crap, they probably won't need to go on strike. It's definitely worth noting that these are pretty much only happening in the North. In the South, when sharecroppers try to unionize, they're met with extreme violence. On October 1st, 1919, in Phillips County, Arkansas, black sharecroppers met to organize terms to bring to the attention of local planters concerning payment for the previous year's crop and better terms for the upcoming year. When white locals learned of the meeting, they ambushed the group, which led to a skirmish and the firing of shots. White locals then stormed the city looking to kill African Americans. The death toll of the ensuing massacre was 5 white people and an unknown number of African Americans gathered from written accounts ranging from 20 to nearly 900, although the best estimates are around 100. The Red Scare also led to a massive upkick in nativism, or anti-immigrant hatred, in the United States. This took really 2 super obvious forms in the 1920s. First was the Immigration Acts of 1921 and, more importantly, 1924. What the Immigration Act of 1924 did was establish a quota system for immigration, which is essentially cutting off based on a certain percentage. In this case, the federal government made the rule that they were going to restrict immigrant populations coming into the United States to 2% of the number of each nationality's population residing in the United States as of the 1890 census. Super critically, this essentially meant cutting off massive numbers of immigrants from Eastern Europe, since they weren't a massive presence in the United States until after that census year. This wasn't the government's first federal national immigration policy, since the Chinese Exclusion Act was clearly a federally mandated immigration law, but it was extremely long lasting. We didn't change it until the mid 1960s. And the Eastern Europeans targeted by the law were targeted very specifically because they were the ones most feared for bringing in ideas of communism to the United States. So think places like Russia and their revolution less than a decade before. On top of this, the rules of justice broke down when it came to cases concerning immigrants or people perceived to be radicals, which itself is a super loose term. Probably one of the best examples of this is the Massachusetts case of the trial against Sacco and Vanzetti. In April 1920, Sacco and Vanzetti, 2 Italian immigrants and self-identified socialists, were put on trial for the murder of a shoe factory paymaster and his guard. In reality, there wasn't a single piece of tangible evidence that tied the men to the case, except that they happened to show up in an auto mechanic several days later to pick up a car authorities chose from a separate crime to connect to the murders, also with no evidence. During the trial, the prosecutor made no real effort to even tie the men to the physical crime itself, but only focused on their background as political radicals, which, remember, isn't actually a crime. And both Sacco and Vanzetti openly admitted to this in court because, one, they weren't ashamed of it, and two, it's not actually a crime. Their political affiliation had nothing to do with a simple robbery, in theory. But the jury didn't care that there was no evidence tying them to the murders. The fact that they, quote, seemed like murderers was enough, what the prosecutor called having, quote, a consciousness of guilt. Both men were found guilty. Despite a storm of protests by fellow socialists and other radicals, and even just people who saw through the sham trial, the verdict stuck. Because we have to remember that the vast majority of Americans at this point supported the government's interventions with the Red Scare. The Palmer raids and other crackdowns were very popular with the public, even in the face of what was clearly, in this instance, a breakdown of the judicial system. Both men were executed in August 1927. Our last form of ideological conflict is really a mixture of nativism and racism. In the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan reemerged as a dominant force in white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, sometimes referred to as WASP, communities. This obviously isn't the first time we've seen the Klan in U.S. history, though. During the period of Reconstruction, the Klan emerged as a social and political organization whose primary purpose was preventing African American men from exercising their right to suffrage or voting. In the 1920s, the new wave of the Klan looked remarkably different in a variety of ways. In 1915, the film Birth of a Nation came out, adapted from a book called The Klansman by Thomas Dixon Jr. The 3-hour movie plot starts with the Civil War and chronicles the KKK riding in to save the South from what they propagandized as the uncivilized rule of African Americans during Reconstruction. Pretty much immediately, the film's popularity led to a massive leap in Klan membership nationally. If you look at the image on the screen, this is a rally from KKK Day at the Texas State Fair in 1923, where thousands of new members were inducted. But the film wasn't the only thing drawing thousands of people to the newest iteration of the Klan. The ethos of the KKK in the 1920s spoke to what a lot of white Protestants, especially those from the middle class, deeply believed in. The Klan of the 20s didn't limit their discrimination to African Americans and voting rights, but targeted Catholics and Jews as well as immigrants. They portrayed their cause as simultaneously one of religious conservatism and patriotic fervor, concepts that they saw as two sides of the same coin rather than separate spheres of society or their identities. For these white Americans, to be American was to be white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant. Failure to check off any of these boxes was failure to meet with the standards of Americanness. Unlike the Reconstruction Klan, the KKK of the 20s didn't necessarily exclude women from this rhetoric. In fact, the 20s Klan welcomed women into its ranks because, quite honestly, women were a whole lot better at public relations than men were. Using women's new political capital to their advantage, the Klan established a separate women's KKK section where women organized around ideas of xenophobia and nativism, racial segregation, and keeping out the, quote, rising tide of color. But whereas the men's group did these things with large gatherings and speeches that sometimes inspired criticism, women's groups talked about them over picnics and food drives, the proceeds of which went to fellow Klan families. They were especially effective in petitioning for local and state-level reforms, like changes to school curriculums to add more patriotic elements, or creating wet-dry laws locally in the years just before Prohibition. Because the hyper-patriotism embodied in this wasn't seen by most white people as really negative in any way, members of the 20s Klan weren't necessarily out to hide who they were. We often think of the Klan as traditionally hooded and semi-secretive, but this wasn't necessarily the case. Klan members of the 20s took part in parades and ceremonies, and one can find any number of photos of these events where the identities of those involved are extremely easy to uncover. Klansmen and Klanswomen saw themselves as protectors of a certain way of life, not as members of a terrorist organization. In fact, when you take away their hatred for African Americans, the Klan's stance on immigration and anti-Catholicism is incredibly similar to that of the Know Nothing Party of the mid-19th century. But as with any organization, separating out the portions of their ideology doesn't really provide a holistic or accurate portrayal. That's not to say that all members of the Klan measured their thoughts on each of the listed groups here equally, because certainly they didn't, based on a variety of factors like personal background and even where they lived. But the act of actually joining the organization meant that one was on board with the entire program. One of the really terrible things to kick off the 1920s, which springs out of this ideology of racial hatred, is the Red Summer of 1919. This is a period of massacres against mostly African American communities that gets its name from NAACP leader James Weldon Johnson. Since we literally just talked about the KKK, I want to be really abundantly clear that while Klan activity and ideology certainly played a role in these massacres, they most certainly weren't all started by the KKK or even linked to that organization. So, during and following the First World War, there are actually a lot of really great things going on in the African American community, broadly speaking. While African American troops served overseas, the 803rd Infantry Band introduced blues and jazz to French audiences for the first time, a well received form of relaxation and release for war torn troops and civilians. At home, the NAACP organized protests against the mistreatment of black soldiers overseas and at home that ultimately led to the training and commissioning of several hundred African American military officers. They also won battles in court like the 1915 case Ginn versus U.S., which said that the use of the grandfather clause in Maryland and Oklahoma was illegal. Economically, segregated enclave cities in Tulsa's Greenwood district, nicknamed Black Wall Street, flourished in the wake of the war's industrial boom and post-war prosperity. The community was developed by African Americans who were formerly enslaved by native tribes in Oklahoma. They used the local rail line and land gained through the Dawes Act to establish a close-knit community, which they built up over decades to a flourishing economic boomtown. World War I production and the Great Migration also led to new forms of income for many African Americans, often in higher paying jobs as a result of wartime labor practices, even if those didn't stay forever. But with these successes came extreme backlash, predominantly from white communities. The problem was that in this period following World War I, the African American community wasn't going to just sit down and do nothing about racist attitudes across the country. Returning soldiers wore their uniforms in public with pride. Black laborers knew exactly what they were worth and were willing to speak up for that, both in the industrial North and agricultural South. Black families paid significantly less attention to the social norms of segregation in public spaces. And the entire time, white Americans are reacting to this. Charles Lewis, a recently discharged soldier, was lynched in uniform in December 1918. The kind of behavior here wasn't new either. It happened during the Spanish-American War just years earlier. In 1898, Black Army Private James Neely was shot by white men in Georgia for protesting his right to be served at a soda fountain. So what happens in the summer of 1919 is really just a compounding and continuation of attitudes and actions that have been present this entire time. The first act of violence against Black Americans occurs in May in Charleston. From there, other violent outbursts happen in small cities across the nation. Larger massacres happen in more populated cities. In Washington, D.C., a 4-day massacre swept the city after a white woman accused an African American man of attempting to steal her umbrella. The Chicago massacre started after white beachgoers stoned and drowned a black teenager for swimming on the wrong side of the beach. For nearly 2 weeks, white Chicagoans set fire to black homes and businesses, leaving over 1,000 homeless and killing around 50 people. In the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Black Wall Street, white mobs attacked the area after a white woman accused a man from the area of allegedly assaulting her. They burned down the city, forced the residents to leave, and firebombed it with commandeered planes. And just like with the Red Scare, the press played a major role in fueling the hatred. Massacres and riots made for great articles and sales. Inflammatory headlines like the one on the screen didn't have to be true in order to get people to read the paper. Fear is a great selling point. This was true of media then and is true of media today. And in the 20s, there was plenty of fear to draw on between the Red Scare, labor problems, and racial strife. Our second major form of conflict was a bit more practical than ideological. The passage of the 18th Amendment in 1919 led to a whole host of conflicts as local and state governments, and the federal government to some extent, attempted to enforce the law. The major effects of prohibition really had to do with the ways that people got around enforcement. The actual law itself accounted for prohibiting the quote manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors, end quote, and was then supported, which I use super loosely here, by the Volstead Act in October of 1919. So people got really creative with the ways that they got around this law. As you can see in the image on the left, these guys have a truck that looks like it is a bricklayer's truck, but it really has a false back in it, and inside they can store booze or anything technically. You also have a secret bars that pop up virtually everywhere, but especially in urban environments, called speakeasies. Typically, in order to get into a speakeasy, you have to know somebody who knows the password to get in. And they'd usually have a system for getting rid of the alcohol in a hurry if they need to, like using what's called bathtub rum. Now, bathtub rum can mean a whole host of things, that it was either literally made in a bathtub or that these more hush hush establishments literally kept the alcohol in the bathtub or other similar storage containers that drain, because if the cops come busting into your establishment, you can then just pull the plug and drain it. Sure, you lose all the booze and that's going to waste your profit margin, but you're not going to go to prison, so there's that. But I don't want to make it seem like these speakeasies were necessarily all having to work on the absolute down low. Cops totally knew where they were and what they were doing, and a lot of times they were paid off to not raid them, or to give them like 20 minutes heads up before raiding them so that the bar owners could carefully move all of the alcohol somewhere else, so that when the feds show up, they bust into the place and everybody's sitting at tables having a nice, normal, non-alcoholic dinner. Like, what? And sure, half the people might be super visibly drunk at the time, but the law doesn't say that it's illegal to be drunk. It says it's illegal to make, transport, or sell the liquor. So if they don't find any, there's no crime there. The people transporting the alcohol also got pretty good at not getting caught. In short, the whole concept of people having to drive real fast in the middle of the night with their lights off, to evade the cops obviously, was exhilarating for a lot of people. And when Prohibition eventually ended and those people didn't have any real reason to not do that anymore, they invented what we know of today as NASCAR. But let's get back to this idea of organized crime for a second, because this is actually kind of a big deal during Prohibition. I mean, in order to get alcohol from moonshiners or other producers to the speakeasies and not get caught or know which cops to pay off, you have to have some kind of organizational skills. So this is where essentially our mob bosses and gangsters come in, like our fine-looking gentleman on the left. And that's a mugshot, by the way. Like, why don't we let petty criminals dress up like that for mugshots anymore? It would definitely probably help with like job prospects post-imprisonment if they look that flashy. Anyway, these guys are actually pretty scary dudes. Like, they'll totally kill you. Case in point, the 1929 St. Valentine's Day massacre. That's not to say that all gangsters of the 20s are out to get you like that. This isn't a Godfather movie. But remember that this is the smack middle of the Great Depression. So cut into a mobster's business dealings and you're going to pay for that. But in a lot of ways, organized crime is like not new at all in US history. We've seen this same sort of thing before with our political machines like Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed. I mean, it's not like Boss Tweed and his men confine themselves only to white collar crime. And very much like Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall, the organized crime units in the 20s and 30s are using the common people to their advantage. They're more or less extremely effective politicians. So for example, during the Great Depression, one of the things Al Capone, like that Al Capone, is famous for is running a whole host of soup kitchens across the city of Chicago, which is like not what we typically think of today when we think of Al Capone. But he was very strategic in doing this because he knew that if he was the face of kindness and generosity, if he was the one stepping up and meeting the basic needs of men and women in Chicago when nobody else was, then their loyalty would be to him. That's not to say that Capone didn't genuinely also care about the people of Chicago either. After all, they were the people of his town, and he had the means to help them, even if a lot of the stuff he served was stolen. But it's the same concept as the political machines of the Gilded Age, who would give coffee and blankets and food to immigrants as they arrived in New York. If you take care of them, they'll take care of you. So clearly, Prohibition, as a law at least, isn't doing super well, and there are a whole host of reasons for this that sort of go together as a system. The first and probably most obvious is smuggling. You've got people smuggling in all kinds of creative ways. Hollowed out vehicle compartments, boats from Canada, flasks in their boots, hence bootleggers. etc. And then on top of that, the Volstead Act was just never really enforceable. The federal government never really provided for enough federal prohibition agents, and those that they did provide weren't paid enough for the stupidly dangerous job that they were doing. When the law was first passed, the amount given to pay for it was $2.1 million. 6 years later, the head of the force asked for at least $300 million in order to pay his men and actually enforce the law effectively. He was given $12 million. So obviously this isn't anywhere near enough, which means the people doing the job of enforcing are either quitting in massive numbers or are taking bribes on the other side, because there's a lot less dangerous stuff than getting killed when you find a moonshiner in the middle of the woods all by yourself. And repeatedly, the government's response was that if they needed more support, they could just ask local police officers for backup. But that was stupid, because half the local enforcement, one, were taking even bigger bribes, and two, thought that the law was stupid and an encroachment on their local and state authority anyway. So they're not really in the mood to help. Plus, state governments aren't over the moon about spending state funds to enforce a federal law. So they're not dishing out cash to help the feds enforce a federal law. So paired together, these were just the major issues with prohibition and why it ultimately failed. The federal government passed a law that they were wholly unwilling to spend the money to properly enforce. So in addition to all of the really sort of unhealthy and unproductive conflict that happens during the 20s, we have another entirely different form of conflict happening, which is more focused on harnessing contrasting ideas of art and thought and even history. In the African American community, we already know that World War I brought a lot of changes for both returning servicemen and those who stayed in terms of the Great Migration and the resulting shift from rural to urban landscapes. And this has a huge impact on the Black community in terms of art, music, and academic and intellectual thought. One of the most obvious places we see this happening is in the artistic movement known as the Harlem Renaissance. So if you remember from world history, a Renaissance is a rebirth of culture. And so when we talk about the Harlem Renaissance, this is a rebirth of African American culture that really comes out of the Great Migration. Since after the Great Migration, Harlem's 3 square miles of land had the greatest population density of Black people in the world. But it's really not only Harlem that experiences this boom in Black artistic and intellectual rebirth. It happened in all the major cities that saw African American population growth, like Chicago, Detroit, and Philadelphia, to name a few. And it's important to remember the and rebirth here. We know that as far back as the colonial period, Black Americans have had distinctive cultures, practices, and traditions that have been shaped by unique experiences and regional differences. So the Harlem Renaissance isn't the start of Black culture in the United States. It's just a transformational moment in this huge shift that occurred as a direct result of this particular point in time. And the art and thought that come out of it are extremely reflective of that. For example, in his poem, Let America Be America Again, Langston Hughes grapples with the duality of visions of America's past. The beginning stanzas harken back to a vision of the United States as a land of opportunity and promotion, but then echo with the reality that it was never that for at least some people. The remainder of the poem shares the reality of what the, quote, dream version of America covers up under the rhetoric of exceptionalism, patriotism, and rugged individualism. Hughes' poem is less a criticism of the United States as it is a cry to actually make the country the things it claims to be at the start of the poem, for the nation to actually be the America it pretends to be in its own history books. At the same time, the world of music exploded with new and exciting forms of expression. Jazz came out of West African musical traditions, blues, ragtime, and spirituals. It's typically played with horns and brass instruments and has a more upbeat tempo, which also led to new forms of dance in the 20s. Probably one of the most famous jazz artists of all time is Louis Armstrong, who's known not only for his trumpet playing skills and abilities, but also for his skills as a vocalist. Blues came out of the Deep South and also tends to have a lot in common with West African musical traditions. A lot of blues is indicative of the type of call and response pattern and rhythm that was common in spirituals and field hollers of the colonial and antebellum eras and can often be heard in rock and roll today. Unlike most jazz, although the two styles can often have a lot of similar qualities, blues tends to have almost a trance-like bass line. In the 20s, a lot of the most famous blues singers were women like Bessie Smith, the Empress of Blues. Bessie Smith was among other women blues singers like Gertrude Rainey and Lucille Bogan, who performed pretty widely in vaudeville shows, which contributed to their wider popularity. At the same time as the Harlem Renaissance, white artists in other sections of New York, like Tin Pan Alley, worked on musical scores to sell to popular audiences like those from these vaudeville shows. According to TCU musical theater professor Jessica Humphrey, Tin Pan Alley was a collection of publishing houses that essentially made sheet music. But because you couldn't really tell what that sheet music would sound like by looking at it, you would have to have somebody play it for you. So people would go to this part of town and have a piano player play the song for them. And the sound of this happening in like 10 different buildings on the street sounded like people banging on tin pans, hence Tin Pan Alley. So if someone went and had a song played for them and liked it, they'd buy the sheet music to take home so they could learn to play it themselves. Now, what ends up happening is that some people hear people like Louis Armstrong and Bessie Smith and Lucille Bogan and others at places like the Apollo Theater in Harlem, or maybe at vaudeville performances closer to where they live, and they want to have music like that at home. So these composers like George Gershwin go into the Cotton Club and they learn to compose jazz and blues and other kinds of music coming from musicians like Fats Waller, but then take their classical skills and turn that into music that can be composed and more easily digested by white audiences. And according to Professor Humphrey, the black artist that Gershwin in particular was listening to didn't really take massive offense to this because he actually had the skills to back his work up. He wasn't just some amateur trying to come in and rip off their music. This was also a bit of a two-way street, a way of getting their music into more popular audiences. In addition to the inherent conflict of artistic styles and the grappling with cultural and societal issues that the formation of art inherently brings, the Harlem Renaissance also led to conflict among liberal and conservative ideologies within the black intellectual community. During World War I, W.E.B. Du Bois used the NAACP's newspaper, The Crisis, to convince African Americans to support the war effort. While he had serious personal misgivings about the war itself, including its colonial underpinnings, he did very much hope that winning the war would lead to the advancement of African American civil rights in the United States. When the Army refused to commission black officers above the rank of captain during the war and racial hatred continued essentially uninterrupted, and even intensified after the war, this hope disappeared pretty quickly. But he didn't move away from his stance of continued integration. In the 20s, he was pretty widely criticized by Marcus Garvey. With the passing of Booker T. Washington in 1915, Garvey took over as a new, albeit far more radical, conservative voice in black intellectual circles. Whereas Washington's Atlanta Compromise endorsed the idea of segregation as a temporary measure of making peace with racist Southerners during black advancement, Garvey saw segregation as a pathway to black supremacy, something to be sought out and desired for the health of the black community. He criticized Du Bois's idea of integration as ignorant and stupid, that it was beneath black people to try to integrate with a group of people who were so content to hate them. Garvey created the United Negro Improvement Association, or UNIA, as a means of achieving his goals of black self-sufficiency and separation from the white community. At their first convention in 1920, he developed plans to, quote, go back to Africa by sending willing emigrants to a settlement he planned to establish in Liberia, which existed as a result of America's colonization society, if you remember from last semester. But these plans never really materialized in any form. He did send some people to the Caribbean on his shipping company, the Black Star Line, but then money dried up. And after that, he was under investigation from the federal government for fraud, convicted, and deported to Jamaica after serving half of his term. In fact, despite Garvey's charismatic leadership, a lot of UNIA's actual tangible success had a lot to do with the organization's women that Garvey didn't want in leadership positions to begin with. For example, in 1923, Irene Blackstone called for a boycott on white businesses in Harlem. She argued that black men and women should only give their money to black-owned businesses so that they could uplift their own community. When Garvey went to prison for fraud, it was the women who held down de facto control over the organization. But we can't only view Marcus Garvey's ideas as a singular point in time. Garvey argued at least some of the blame for the lack of respect for black people in America lay within the black community itself, saying, quote, the greatest stumbling block in the way of progress in the race has invariably come from within the race itself, end quote. As one in a line of black conservatives, this isn't the first time or the last that this line of logic has been expressed about the black community from within the black community. The rhetoric was present in Booker T. Washington's system of economic uplift and his Atlanta Compromise, which enabled it here. We'll see it again with other black conservatives and black nationalists like Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam later in the 1960s. This continuous line of logic that's present in both white and black conservative ideologies incorrectly treats the black community as a monolith, a group who does everything the same or thinks the same. This simply isn't the case. Within the black community, just like any other community, divisions along political and economic issues create separation and conflict that guide families and communities to make very different decisions. Garvey's message that black Americans stood in the way of their own progress by simply not working hard enough was a classist assumption as old as slavery itself. It assumed the idea of rugged individualism without properly acknowledging the systemic nature of racism. The 1920s were also a watershed year for conflict surrounding gender. We know that 1920 itself was a big year for women with the passage of the 19th Amendment, but even beyond that, the conflict surrounding gender went so much further than voting. Discussions of gender in the 20s encompassed the very idea of what proper gender roles should be, and even the very definition of gender as a performance of biological sex. And when it came to biological sex, the 20s opened up new avenues for women's agencies over their own bodies while simultaneously adhering to the restrictive social covenants of the time. So in 1920, the states ratified the 19th Amendment, prohibiting discrimination in voting based on sex on a federal level. This was the culmination of efforts by the National American Woman Suffrage Association and the National Woman's Party after years of hard-fought labor. But the 19th Amendment didn't grant suffrage to all women in the United States, not by a long shot. Women of color were targets of racial discrimination in voting just as often as men in their racial demographic. So the same poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and literacy tests that kept men from voting also prohibited them from using their newly established freedom. And women of color knew that this was a battle they'd have to face, but they fought for the right to vote just the same. Even women who knew at the onset that the 19th Amendment wouldn't apply to them fought for the right, knowing that a step forward for women was a step forward for all women. So let's highlight some of these women. In 1912, Mabel Ping-Hua Lee led a suffrage parade at the age of 16 in New York City. Even as a teenager, she was passionate about the cause. As a Chinese immigrant, she wasn't even allowed to become a U.S. citizen and therefore wasn't even allowed to vote, but this didn't matter to her. In 1917, Adelina Nina Otero Warren began leading the New Mexico chapter of the Congressional Union led by Alice Paul. Knowing the population of the area she served, she insisted that any materials distributed in her area be published in both Spanish and English. In 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act made all Native Americans citizens. However, many states still didn't allow them to vote. Zicala Saw, meaning red bird, a member of the Yankton Sioux, fought for Native American citizenship rights. Native Americans weren't granted the right to vote in every state until 1962. Probably one of the most synonymous icons with the 1920s is the flapper, the independent woman who wears shorter hemlines and brighter colors, bobs her hair, goes out at night, and dances the Charleston. And probably the most famous fashion icon of the 20s was Coco Chanel. Even though flapper women sometimes wore flamboyant dresses with silk and feathers on them for going out, Chanel emphasized a set of rules for women's fashion that emphasized simplicity and poise in everyday dress. Today, her ideas are what we would consider the basis of a staple wardrobe. The idea is that there are certain things that all women, and increasingly men in their own fashion, should have in their closet. A set of nice heeled shoes, plain colored sweaters for pairing with blouses, and an LBD or little black dress. But the flapper lifestyle was really more of an ideal. To be a true flapper, to go out partying every night, drinking and dancing in a new dress with new friends, required a lot of money that even in the 20s, most women simply didn't have. So the vast majority of women adopted aspects of flapper culture as they could: dress, hairstyle, dancing. To the extent that the flapper image is really just synonymous with our image of much of 20s style in general. On top of the political and social changes they experienced, women also took part in the ongoing conflict of the sexual revolution in the 20s. This certainly isn't the first time we've discussed women's sexuality or reproductive rights. We talked about the development of new contraceptives like the rubber condom in the antebellum era, and the effect that that had on women's autonomy, despite the fact that it was difficult for many women to purchase them on their own. In the 1920s, the sexual revolution occurred across the backdrop of the social purity movements from the Progressive Era and the official legal action like the Comstock Act that came out of it, which made it illegal to possess or distribute materials about contraception through the mail. And so in the middle of this, you have women like Margaret Sanger, the founder of the American Birth Control League, which is now Planned Parenthood, advocating for the rights of women to be able to not only have access to contraceptives, but actually enjoy their sexual lives without having to worry about if they had plans for a child or an additional child or not. There seems to be a misconception in popular culture that she was also an advocate for abortion, but she actually thought abortion was a terrible practice that she described as, quote, dangerous and vicious. It wasn't even available at Planned Parenthood until after Roe v. Wade in the 1970s. One of the groups Sanger sought to help with her birth control program were women in the Black community through her not necessarily awesomely named for a modern perspective, quote, Negro Project. Sanger knew that the vast majority of birth control clinics opened in the 1930s were for white women only due to segregation. She also knew that years and years and years of medical malpractice led to massive levels of mistrust between African American women and white doctors. So with the guidance and leadership of an advisory council, including Black leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois, Mary McLeod Bethune, and Reverend Adam Clayton Powell, she proceeded to train Black nurses and doctors to educate Black women about various forms of contraceptives. This didn't occur without criticism. Black conservative leaders like Marcus Garvey claimed that Sanger's program was intending to stunt the ability of Black women to reproduce at the exact same time that white women were being told that they should be having more and more children to carry on their supposedly superior genes. During the Progressive Era, Teddy Roosevelt actively promoted this idea to prevent what he considered race suicide among white people in the United States. And often a quote from Sanger's writing, which says, quote, "We do not want word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population," end quote, is used to support this. But this quote is taken out of context from a letter that she wrote to Dr. Clarence Gamble, where she and Dr. Gamble expressed their desire to have the project run by an entirely Black medical staff as to not give the appearance of medical malpractice. Sanger and Gamble don't want there to be any hint that they should be mistrusted, that they are out to exterminate people. So they chose to put the most friendly and most trustworthy people in charge of the operation. This isn't to say that Sanger was a champion for African American civil rights, not by any means. At the same time that she and Gamble were making these plans, she was also working under the very paternalistic assumption that Black Americans couldn't manage to figure out and distribute information about birth control and other contraceptives without her help. In this sense, she was every bit a product of the time she was living in rather than an exception to it. In the same way she was susceptible to the racist prejudices of her context, she was also a proponent of eugenics, as nearly all white Americans were at the time. Sanger was passionate about contraceptives, almost like Alice Paul was passionate about suffrage. She had a singular goal, a singular focus, and she really didn't care too much what it was going to take to get her to that goal in terms of expending political capital. And so during the course of her career, Sanger aligns herself with all sorts of questionable people, from eugenicists to the KKK, because those are the people who hold power and can get what she wants accomplished. That doesn't necessarily mean that she approves of their methods or their message, nor does it excuse from a modern perspective the fact that she aligned herself with those people. But as historians, it's not really our focus to judge what people are doing here. The reason she was doing this was that she saw these people, especially men, as the ones who had power to make tangible change in her world, so she went with it. So if that meant that she needed to align herself with eugenicists for a while because they were the only ones that the government would allow to distribute information about birth control, she was fine with that. But it's also important to realize that her actions did have tangible consequences, despite the benefits that they had for a whole host of women in both white and Black communities. The eugenicists she aligned herself with, in particular, held a lot of sway in American politics, and the ideals that they held were incredibly popular at this point in American life. In the 1927 court case Buck v. Bell, the Supreme Court decided that forced sterilization of the intellectually disabled isn't unconstitutional. Following this decision, over 62,000 people in the United States, mostly women, were sterilized. In the 1920s and 30s, the United States made repeated attempts to sterilize women in Puerto Rico through birth control programs in order to control poverty on the island. By 1965, over a third of childbearing women on the island of Puerto Rico had been sterilized. After World War II, the eugenics atrocities of the Nazis, which they modeled after the state of California's eugenics program, the United States tried to curb some of their own eugenics and sterilization programs. Within the justice system, though, the government officials coerced women with sterilization or experimental birth control trials like Norplant in exchange for lenient sentences. In the welfare system, birth control was used as a precursor for accessing necessary programs. In the 1970s, between a quarter and a half of women of childbearing age who came to Indian Health Services for treatment were sterilized. Similar sterilizations occurred with Latina women in the Southwest in the early parts of that decade. And in 2020, a whistleblower for the Immigration and Customs Enforcement reported non-consensual hysterectomies that occurred in an ICE detention center in Georgia in 2019 amid the COVID-19 outbreak. Margaret Sanger wasn't individually responsible for the mentalities or government responses to eugenics in her time, although she certainly didn't forego her own agenda to stand up against it. But it's important to note that in any movement that claims to make sweeping change like this, someone is inevitably left out. In a country as rich in diversity as ours, any winner-takes-all approach to solving things ultimately has losers. And in this case, the people who lost out were those who didn't have the agency to speak up for their own sexual freedom, and those who didn't have organizations like the Birth Control League in their corner, the disabled, the poor, the immigrant classes. But the sexual revolution did open doors for discussion, and in ways that Sanger probably didn't intend. At the same time that there was a revolution in the realm of sexual norms and reproductive rights of women, there was also a discussion about gender and gender identities as a whole. Flourishing nightclubs in neighborhoods like Harlem and Greenwich Village provided a haven for gay, lesbian, and transgender communities in New York, featuring drag balls and stage performances by female impersonators. As centers of the Black community and more bohemian lifestyles, these two enclaves of New York in particular spoke to the intersectionality of the LGBTQ plus culture and other forms of social oppression and expression. But it wasn't just New York where the LGBTQ plus community thrived. Urban centers like Chicago and San Francisco in particular had similar social centers. And the expression of gender identity wasn't just limited to nightlife and communities on the edge of society. In the arts, popular artists like Julian Eltinge and Marlene Dietrich challenged traditional gender norms in their performances. As a vaudeville performer in the early 20th century, Eltinge exposed the culturally constructed nature of gender by performing as a beautiful example of femininity on stage while being known as intensely masculine in his personal engagements. Dietrich, on the other hand, was widely known for having relationships with both men and women, and for her famous cross-dressing role in the film Morocco in 1930. With the widespread popularity of motion pictures and a slew of scandals involving film producers and stars in the 1920s came a series of production codes to ensure the quality of films. In theory, these codes were actually voluntary, but if production companies wanted their films played in the United States, they were really mandatory. They included things like bans on nudity, suggestive dancing, lustful kissing, mocking religion, interracial couples, and showing off criminal activity realistic enough that somebody might actually try it. And of course, a strict adherence to traditional gender norms is to avoid any indication of homosexuality, which was illegal in most states under a variety of sodomy laws. It wasn't until the 1950s that individual directors began challenging these codes in their films. Stage production wasn't the only place where the challenging of gender roles came to the forefront, though. The writing of authors like F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, Sinclair Lewis, and T.S. Eliot all include discussions of gender dynamics and the role of traditional masculinity in American society. Hemingway and Fitzgerald in particular represented two extreme opposites of the spectrum. While there are clear indications of the homosexual tension in both men's writings, Hemingway projected an outward appearance of hypermasculinity and was never really afraid to threaten to fight someone. While according to some literary scholars, Fitzgerald perceived his own homosexual tendencies less as an overt attraction to men and more as a moral effect of his chosen profession and upbringing and relative wealth and comfort. But the writings of men in this genre wasn't solely about gender, not even remotely. They were part of what fellow author Gertrude Stein dubbed the lost generation. She wrote, quote, "All of you young people who served in the war, you are a lost generation. You have no respect for anything. You drink yourselves to death," end quote. And she meant this really as a literary critique as much as a personal criticism of these men, who generally moved to Europe where she lived after World War I as a form of escapism. In their writing, they were heavily critical, disillusioned really with the war and its causes. If you look at our poem here by Hemingway, All Armies Are the Same, he's saying that all armies from all wars are out for the same thing. They promise fame and valor, but at the end of the day, war brings nothing but death. The idea that countries try to draw young men into wars and military service with the promise of adventure and the promise of something they can be proud of. Valor is the attribute of boys. But that anyone who has ever actually served in a war like the one they just experienced knows that these are all lies. Dead bodies have always drawn flies, he says. War only results in death. A lot of them heaped loads of criticism on the U.S. government for pursuing involvement in World War I as a means of making money, arguing that it was really just a war of self-interest and a way for large corporations to make money off military contracts, which, if you remember, is actually not far off from the very kinds of remarks that got Eugene Debs thrown in prison only a few years before. They also tended to look at the United States' emphasis on hyper-patriotism and hyper-religious fervor as potentially dangerous encroachments on Americans' democratic rights. As Sinclair Lewis warned, quote, "When fascism comes to America, it will be wrapped in the flag and carrying a cross." This kind of thinking was particularly reflected in groups like the Ku Klux Klan that used symbols of patriotism and Protestantism to craft racist and nativist messages for popular public consumption and political influence. And so, in a lot of ways, the artists of the Lost Generation criticized both the war itself, but also the consumerist tendencies of Americans in the 20s who quickly forgot about it so much because they hadn't forgotten these men. As James Thurber wrote, quote, "You are all a lost generation," Gertrude Stein said to Hemingway. "We weren't lost. We knew where we were all right, but we wouldn't go home. Ours was the generation that stayed up all night." The 1920s was far from perfect and far from simply the commercialized image of prosperity and fun that typically embodies Great Gatsby throwback parties today. But the messiness and conflict of the 20s, both in the sense of tangible hostile conflict and ideological and social conflict, led to actual change in all levels of American society that lasted well into the following decades and impacted not only social life but government policy and reform.